Thanks for tuning in to this video about language analysis. This is for, I suppose, mainly GCSE English language, but I don't see why it wouldn't help with literature either. And in this video, I'm going to be using a specific activity that I saw in training the other week from the exam board, and it's called the crunchit activity. And the idea is it's to get students to zoom in to significant words rather than just making generalized comments about phrases, to actually take specific words and really kind of talk about them in great length. So, I mean, this might also be useful for some A-level courses for English. Hopefully it's going to be useful, perhaps an activity to use to really develop some insightful comments about specific words in an extract. So, as we may know, all English courses, whether that be language or literature, or GCSE and sometimes A level, require students or yourselves, if you are the student, to analyse language to some extent. So, with language analysis, we need to remember that we're trying to explain why specific words have been chosen, and we're assuming that the writer has chosen these words deliberately, because some writers will really think carefully about how they are conveying meaning to us, and they understand that they are manipulating our emotions based on the words that they use. So we need to appreciate that language creates emotive reactions and makes us feel things. With language analysis, particularly for GCSE anyway, there is an element of needing to use terminology, but this question is not about future spotting. So what I don't want students to do is just think that they're finding a simile or a metaphor. It's more than that. It's actually, what does that metaphor and simile tell us about something? Again, because this is a reading task, you are selecting evidence judiciously and selectively, making sure that you're not quoting long quotes because that will just waste time, but you're trying to be specific about the references that you're making. So, a good question that I've heard in terms of helping you to think about the effects on readers is, what does the word make you think, feel, or imagine? By answering that question, you are giving some indication that there is a response in the reader in terms of the words that we use. So this is how not to do language analysis. And you can see the main problem with this is the fact that we've got a very long quote. And this quote is then, the student has taken a lot longer to write this quote than they've actually written about the effects of it. And it should be the other way around. You need to write shorter quotes, but longer stuff about the effects of the language. Okay, so in this extract, I'm using the Rosabel extract, which many of you might be familiar with because it's been around now for almost a decade. But when we're looking at this quote, this reference, we need to ask ourselves, what is this quote for? Because when we quote something, the idea is we're going to talk about something in that quote afterwards. So in this quote, I would expect a student to pick on the word sickening, or pick on the word greasy, or pick on the word oozing, and really develop the ideas about that specific word. But what they've done is they've instead just opted to make a generalized comment about imagery. This creates imagery, which is interesting. Well, what imagery? Why is it interesting? What specific imagery do we have? These kind of questions. So this actually would not do very well in a language task, and it would not be GCSE standard. So what the student needs to do is shorten the quote and also pick on specific words, not just quote something and then move on. Okay, so that's what this crunch activity is designed to do. So the crunch activity is a grid, essentially, and if you've watched my videos from previous years, you'll know that I'm a big fan of grids and tables and color coding. So this suits me right down to the ground. So this is what the grid looks like. So the text goes in the left-hand column. In the middle column, you have the student selecting one word from each line. And in the right-hand column is where students will develop their ideas about a specific word that they've taken from their middle column. So we're going to just do this kind of structured in this video. So because I'm using the Rosabel extract I'm going to put in the left-hand column. Okay, so Rosabel looked out of the windows. The street was blurred and misty, but the light striking on the panes turned their dullness to opal and silver, and the jewellers' shops seen through this were fairy palaces. Her feet were horribly wet, and she knew the bottom of her skirt and petticoat would be coated with blank, greasy mud. I think that's supposed to be black, greasy mud, isn't it? Okay, there was a sickening smell of warm humanity. It seemed to be oozing out to everybody in the bus, and everybody had the same expression, sitting so still, staring in front of them. Rosabel stirred suddenly and unfastened the two top buttons of her coat. She felt almost stifled. Through her half-closed eyes, the whole row of people on the opposite seat seemed to resolve into a meaningless, staring face. So that is the language extract that they give you to talk about the language in this Rosabel extract. The reason I've picked this Rosabel extract is I've always found that students have found this extract slightly challenging. I don't quite know why, but this I wanted to see how this crunchit task works with more challenging texts. So the next step is to take one word from each line of this extract and write it into the middle column. So you're aiming for something like this. And the good thing about this, of course, is that there's no right or wrong answers. This is purely your own ideas. And for me, these are the words that stick out to me in each of these lines. So I'm kind of forgetting the rest. It's a bit like a sieve. It's getting rid of all the stuff we don't want and really focusing on words that we do. So the words in the middle column now, I attribute a greater significance to in the language of this bus journey. So then what we do is we go kind of paragraph by paragraph, so 3 times. We zoom in to specific words. So I've noticed, and I did this activity with my students recently, is I asked them to notice a pattern of words. And to notice patterns and semantic fields is actually a very high level thing to do with language because you have to see the extract as a whole rather than just see it as a kind of a specific individual thing. Sometimes writers will use patterns of words which reinforce a concept. So my students noticed when we did this that dullness, silver, and horribly wet are all relatively unpleasant. So they realised that the writer was doing something here in terms of reinforcing this sense of gloom, this contrast between light and kind of dark. So whereas the outside seems bright, appealing, and fantastical, the inside is the complete opposite. It's miserable and gloomy. And it's those words that do that. And of course, if you're going to put yourself in her shoes and you've been at work all day and the weather is horrible and you're soaked because of the rain and whatever, and you're now on a horrible, smelly bus, you want to escape that. So she's looking out of the window, looking at her surroundings as if her surroundings are almost another world, like a fairy story, like a fairy tale. So she wants to escape her normal everyday life, which is unsurprising considering the situation that she's in. Notice once I have selected those words in the middle, I've also tried to give them a terminology or a feature. So we've got a noun, an adjective, an adverb, and another adjective. So the terminology is also can be put into that middle column. In the second paragraph, my students also notice a pattern. They notice that these words are all pretty unpleasant. Greasy, which is an adjective. Sickening smell, which is sibilant, but also an adjective, sickening. And the verb oozing, which again is not particularly pleasant. So again here my students noticed a semantic field, and it's a semantic field as something that's quite dirty or unpleasant, making this journey seem miserable. So to use kind of analysis words, reinforces, emphasizes, foregrounds. These words in yellow foreground and emphasize and reinforce the unpleasantness of this miserable journey that she's taking at the end of the day. Obviously, it's public transport, which means you have a lack of control of who your fellow passengers are. And the word oozing, the verb oozing, again, is pretty unpleasant, suggesting that the smell of the passengers is kind of consuming the bus. It's overflowing in the bus. So there's just this general atmosphere of dirt and just general misery, really. So again, this crunch activity helps students notice the pattern there in terms of what was being reinforced. And finally, the last paragraph, we decided to look at stifled and meaningless, those two adjectives, um, which suggests that this bus is very hot, very uncomfortable, very humid, which is why she's taking her, um, undoing her coat buttons. But as she glances across the aisle in this bus, she's noticing that they all have the same expression, which is they all feel the same. They're all kind of miserable and not enjoying this journey or this commute very much. So there's a degree there of just kind of this passive behavior. So that is what the crunchit activity is. It's making a judgment about what you regard to be the most important words, and then noticing if there's any patterns in those words. Are there any words that share perhaps the same semantic field, which reinforce a particular aspect or mood? So going back then to an example of what good language analysis looks like, again, we have the example on the left, which we discussed earlier, which is how not to do language analysis. But on the right-hand side, we now have a much better example. The writer conveys the miserable commute inside the bus in which Rosabel travels. The semantic field of negative words, such as the adjectives greasy and sickening and the verb oozing, reinforces how the journey is made unpleasant because of the dampness in the winter air and because of the smells of her fellow passengers. As she is taking public transport, she has a lack of control over her fellow passengers and who are, sorry, she has a lack of control over who her fellow passengers are, and this is fueling her antipathy towards the journey. So antipathy means just general misery about something. So that's much better. The quotes are shorter, they're judiciously selected. We've also got some impressive terminology in here, and the writer is much clearer on what the effect of this language is. So, effectively, what is the writer trying to tell us about this bus journey using the language? So, using the crunch activity, whether that be for revision or in lessons, might be a really good way to practice this idea of zooming in to particular words rather than simply just making general quotes which don't really deal with specific words and the connotations of them. Okay, so hopefully that was useful, and thank you very much for watching.